Hello, welcome to our second lesson on our series on Theme B, Religion and Life. This lesson is all about the origins of the universe. My name is Mr. Wood and it's great to be here with you today. Our objectives today are to understand the Big Bang Theory. We're also going to be having a good overview of the Genesis account of creation, and we're going to evaluate whether or not these two views are conflicting or whether they are compatible with each other. Your need to know today is this, that whilst for a minority of religious believers, the scientific truth claims about the origins of the universe conflict with their religious beliefs. However, for the majority of religious believers, the two truths are compatible. Let's jump into today's learning. So last lesson we introduced this concept that religious truth claims and scientific truth claims are different, they have different functions and they're valuable in different ways. And sometimes religious people, they need to stop and think and decide whether or not the claims from some scientific evidence and their own religious truth claims can work together. Are they compatible or are they at odds? Are they conflicting? One of these areas is in the origins of the universe, how the universe came to be, how all of this came to exist. This is a really important area of study for everyone in a way, because when you know how and why this all came about, it can help understand purpose for your own life and affect decisions like how should we treat each other, how should we treat the universe, how should we treat animals, etc. So it's a really important area, and every religion's got a different backstory, if you will, a different creation story about how the universe came into being. And as time's gone by, we've gained a better and deeper understanding of the science behind it all as well. So let's start by thinking about the Big Bang Theory. So the Big Bang Theory suggests that the universe is around 20 billion years old. So about 20 billion years ago, we went from nothing to something. That there was an explosion, and out of that explosion came cloud, dust, gases, and over millions and millions of years, these formed stars and planets and all sorts, including planet Earth. And then around 3.5 billion years ago, the conditions were just right on planet Earth for life to begin. So that's a very, very basic overview of the Big Bang Theory. Now, a few things to know about the Big Bang Theory is that it replaced a theory that was already in place called the steady state theory. And that's an interesting thing about science, that this theory is currently what we think is true based on repeated observation and what we know about the universe. But however, it might be that one day a new theory comes into play and replaces the Big Bang Theory as the one that is most commonly held. There is a theory called pulsation hypothesis theory, that maybe that's waiting in the wings, ready to come out when the time comes. So a couple of things about the Big Bang. Number one, that's what we believe at the moment. We might not always believe it. We might get more evidence that suggests something else. And secondly, a huge area of question is what happened before the Big Bang, or what happened that caused the Big Bang. And when it comes to that question, the jury is out. That brings us to the story of creation in the book of Genesis. So you're probably familiar, I'm sure, with Genesis, which means the beginning or beginnings. And Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then it goes into this creation story about God speaking the earth into existence. And it comes in different stages. Before it kicks off, it says that the earth is formless and empty, and darkness is mentioned, and then God speaks and things happen. So he says, let there be light, and there was light. And we get this separation, if you will, from dark to light. And then again, another separation of sea and sky, and then a third separation of land and sea. And you can see a bit of repetition to the story. It's almost poetic, which is a word I'll come back to, but you get this kind of like separate, 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 and then 3 days of filling. So we then get the filling of the light and dark with sun, moon, and stars. We get that we had sea and sky, and then we get fish and birds on the 5th day, and then on the 6th day we get animals and humans who are described to be made in the image of God. And then, as you're probably aware, the 7th day God rests. So that's again a very basic overview of Genesis 1, the story of creation. It's definitely worth reading that for yourself, especially if you're studying this at GCSE or A level. And so with that basic overview of both the Big Bang Theory and the creation story from Genesis, we have to ask the question, are these two stories compatible or are they conflicting? Is it possible to believe in both the Big Bang and the creation story from Genesis, or are they so at odds that you couldn't believe in both? Well, just to recap on last lesson, we talked about this chap, Dr. Francis Collins, a world-renowned scientist who is a Christian, an evangelical Christian who believes the Bible is true, but who also believes in the Big Bang and also believes in the theory of evolution. And so, yes, it is possible to believe in both, but how? Well, it all comes down to interpretation. So different Christians who read the book of Genesis would generally accept what they're reading in one of three different ways. They either take a literal interpretation of it, they take a metaphoric or a poetic interpretation of it, or they're somewhere in between. Let's have a look at those three right now. So some Christians have a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis, which means that they would read the story and they would take it as a historical account of what happened when God made the world. So they would see the Genesis story as 6 different 24-hour periods of time within a resting 24-hour period at the end for God. Now, there's some pros and cons of doing it like this. If you take the Bible completely literally, it makes things very simple in terms of you would accept whatever's there, and once you've accepted it, anything that kind of contradicts it must be wrong. There's a few problems with this interpretation. One would be, for me personally, when it gets to day 3, if you took this as a literal account, the sun gets made on day 3, and we know that one of the ways that a day is measured is that the earth rotates on its way around the sun. So if a day can really truly be measured from day 3, then how do we get these 24-hour periods of time for day 1 and day 2? That's one of a few issues with this literal interpretation. It also would potentially make the earth way too young from how old we think it is through scientific research and understanding. So if you take a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis, it does cause quite a big bit of conflict from what we know from science. Then you've got a metaphorical or a poetic or symbolic way of reading Genesis. And one of the reasons a Christian might do this is because the Genesis story is kind of laid out a bit like a poem. I kind of explained there when I went through it. It's separate, and then it's fill, and it's got a bit of rhythm to it in the Hebrew. So many would not take it as a historical account. They'd say it's some sort of poem, some sort of song, maybe written by Moses a long time ago. But what's important isn't the small details. What's important is remembering that God made the world. And when God made the world, he made it good. And when he made human beings, it was very good. And the meaning of that, for Christians who take it with a metaphorical understanding, is more important than the specifics of what was done when. And if you took a metaphoric interpretation of Genesis 1, you would have no problem with the science because it matches up. Then you've got the third group of Christians who are probably somewhere in between the two. Now, there's some interesting stuff about Genesis 1. I have a friend who's an atheist, and I remember he said to me once, one thing he couldn't get his head around is that Genesis 1 is just the correct order. Everything's in the right order from what we know by science, especially when it comes to evolutionary ideas about life starting in the sea and then humans evolving last. And he said, I don't know how it was a big coincidence, he said, that they managed to get that right. We also know from Genesis that the word used that's translated day is yom, which is a Hebrew word which means period of time. So you could interpret Genesis to say, well, this happened in the first period of time, and then this in the second period of time, and this in the third period of time. And you're not limited to those 24-hour days. Also, the purpose of Genesis 1 is potentially it's not meant to be a historical account. So if you're looking for a historical account of the beginning of the world, maybe Genesis 1 isn't the right place to look, because the author who wrote that had a purpose behind it. And for many Christians, that wasn't to record a scientific account of what came to be at the very start of the world. And if you imagine, if God was telling Moses this to write it down and say, well, this is an account of how the world came to be, Moses would not have had the vocabulary to understand things like survival of the fittest and evolution and some of the biological and astrophysical terms that he would truly need to comprehend what was occurring with the Big Bang and with evolution. So hopefully that wasn't too much of an information overload for you today. Got some questions for you now. If you'd like to just pause it, have a go at them yourself, and then when you're ready, push play and we'll talk through the answers. Just make sure you have a go at them first, because you really need to put your brain to work if you want to learn some stuff today. Okay, let's look at some of the answers to these questions. So number one, give a brief explanation of the Big Bang. Hopefully you wrote something around 20 billion years ago, an explosion occurred which brought everything into being. Clouds of dust and gas formed planets and stars over time, and eventually this resulted in the universe as we know it. Something like that would be grand. One thing we didn't mention already is that one of the reasons we think the Big Bang occurred is because we think the universe is still expanding, and there's other bits of evidence to suggest that that is the case. Brief overview of the stages. So I'll try and do this real quick. So we've got light and dark, we've got sky and sea, we've got land and sea. That's our three separate, and then our three fill. We've got sun, moon, stars, we've got fish and birds, and we've got animals and humans. And then if you want to add it, God rested. Complete the Bible quote. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1 verse 1. Three possible interpretations for the story of creation. So you've got a literal interpretation. Everything happens exactly as it says in 24-hour periods of time. You've got a metaphoric or metaphorical interpretation, which is that Genesis 1 is a poem. And it's not meant to be taken literally. It's meant to be a story we can learn from. And number three, something in between the two, where God did create the world like it says, but it happened over a much longer period than in 6 literal 24-hour periods of time. What could the creation story teach Christians about God, about the earth, and about themselves? Well, the creation story can teach Christians that God is all-powerful and all-loving and creative, because he brought the earth into being and the universe into being through just speaking. It can teach them that the earth has value, that it is good, and God said it's good when he makes it. And it could teach Christians that they are very good, and that they are the pinnacle of his creation, and that he cares for them and has given them responsibility. And there are a few topics we're going to unpick in later lessons. Number 6, scientific and religious views about the origins of the universe are incompatible. Do you agree? Consider 2 points of view. Well, the 2 key things here to think at are that for many Christians, most Christians, I would say, no, they're not incompatible. They can work hand in hand. It is possible to believe in the Big Bang and also in the creation story, as most Christians do today. If you Google it, you'll see that the Pope in 1951 was a big supporter of the Big Bang theory. It's simply a myth that Christians don't accept the Big Bang. So if you've been told that before, lose that now. It is completely possible for that to happen. On the other hand, if you take a perfectly literal interpretation of Genesis 1, that does make it more difficult. So hopefully you've explored both of those views in your answer. The extension there was to look at biologos.org, really interesting website. Hope you had a chance to do that. So that brings us to the end of our lesson, and let's just revisit our need to know. You need to know that whilst for a minority of religious believers, the scientific truth claims about the origins of the universe conflict with their religious beliefs. But for the majority, the 2 truths are compatible. Thanks for tuning in today. Looking forward to seeing you next lesson. Have a great day.